Power is often imagined as something that fails because it does not see. That empires fall when they are blind to the world beyond their borders, when arrogance seals their eyes. But the Ottoman court did see Europe. It watched it closely, persistently, for more than a century. The misreading did not come from ignorance. It came from authority, mistaking familiarity for comprehension and continuity for control. What follows is not a story of sudden decline or dramatic confrontation, but of a ruling structure that believed it understood its rival well enough to manage delay, only to discover, too late, that its own interpretive frame had become the constraint. The stakes were not military alone, they were epistemic. The Ottoman court governed an empire that had long defined Europe as a frontier problem, not a civilizational equal. For generations, Europe appeared fragmented, quarrelsome, internally divided. This perception was not inaccurate, but power rarely fails by misjudging facts. It fails by misjudging what facts mean once authority has committed itself to a particular reading of the world. In the late 17th century, the Sublime Porte still governed from a position of assumed centrality. The Sultan's court in Istanbul was not merely an administrative center, it was a cosmological one. Authority flowed outward from it, structured by precedent, ceremony, and a legal administrative tradition that had absorbed conquest into routine. Europe existed within this worldview as a zone of negotiation and pressure, not transformation. Treaties were instruments of management, wars were episodes. Time itself felt cyclical. After the failed siege of Vienna in 1683, Ottoman officials did not interpret the event as a turning point in Europe's ascent. They interpreted it as a miscalculation within a familiar pattern. The court responded not by reimagining Europe, but by recalibrating diplomacy, adjusting military appointments, and reaffirming inherited hierarchies. The Habsburgs were treated as one rival among many. The structural shift underway inside Europe, its accelerating capacity for coordination, finance, and institutional learning, remained conceptually external to Ottoman authority. In the early 18th century, Ottoman embassies began traveling more frequently to European courts. Reports returned describing cannon foundries, standing armies, and new administrative practices. These observations were detailed, often precise, but they were filtered through an assumption that innovation was episodic, not cumulative. European techniques were seen as borrowable without consequence, detachable from the political cultures that sustained them. Authority believed it could import instruments, without importing pressures. A silence followed each report, not a literal silence, but an institutional one. Information arrived faster than it could be integrated. The court possessed mechanisms for adjudicating disputes, allocating offices, and maintaining legitimacy, but it lacked mechanisms for synthesizing systemic change across domains. Military reform remained isolated from fiscal reform. Diplomatic adaptation did not restructure governance. Each response preserved hierarchy while narrowing future options. By the mid-18th century, the Ottoman court still regarded Europe as unstable. Revolutions, wars of succession, and shifting alliances reinforced the belief that European strength was temporary, volatile, and self-canceling. Authority mistook turbulence for weakness. It did not recognize that instability could coexist with expansion, that fragmented states could nonetheless generate shared methods, shared tempo, shared expectations. The court saw disorder. It did not see acceleration. When the Ottomans suffered defeats against Russia in the late 18th century, they framed them as regional crises rather than signals of a broader transformation. Treaties like Küçük-Kaynarca were negotiated to restore balance, not to reassess premise. Each concession was understood as temporary, recoverable. Authority remained intact because legitimacy had not yet been directly challenged at the center. Losses at the periphery did not feel existential to the court. Reform efforts followed, but they were framed defensively. New military units were created alongside old ones. European instructors were hired, but their authority remained bounded. Innovation was permitted only insofar as it did not disturb existing chains of legitimacy. The Janissaries were criticized, yet preserved. The court sought improvement without displacement, adjustment without surrender. Power attempted to modernize while remaining recognizable to itself. Here, the misreading deepened. Europe's transformation was not merely technical, it was institutional and temporal. Authority in Europe increasingly operated through impersonal systems, bureaucracies, standardized training, fiscal extraction, that compressed feedback loops. Decisions traveled faster, errors were corrected sooner. The Ottoman court, by contrast, governed through deliberation, mediation, and personal authority. These had once been strengths. Now, they introduced delay. Delay did not feel dangerous. It felt prudent. The court believed that caution preserved legitimacy. Rapid change risked disorder, rebellion, and loss of obedience. Authority equated stability with survival. Yet each postponed reform increased the cost of future adjustment. Power narrowed its own maneuvering room while believing it was preserving optionality. By the early 19th century, European states no longer approached the Ottoman Empire as a peer competitor. They approached it as an object of management. Diplomatic language shifted. Interventions were framed as protections, guarantees, necessities. The court registered these intrusions, but interpreted them as temporary impositions rather than structural reclassification. Authority still spoke the language of sovereignty, even as its meaning thinned. Internal reforms intensified. The Tanzimat decrees aimed to rationalize administration, standardize law, and centralize authority. On paper, they represented adaptation. In practice, they revealed the depth of misalignment. Reforms depended on compliance from provincial elites, whose legitimacy predated reform. Authority issued decrees that traveled slowly, arrived unevenly, and encountered negotiated resistance. Each reform required further mediation, further compromise, further dilution. The court misread European pressure again, not as an accelerating external force, but as a series of demands to be managed diplomatically. Capitulations expanded, financial oversight increased. Yet authority remained convinced that the core remained sovereign so long as the Sultan's legitimacy was ritually intact. Power measured itself by continuity of form, not by capacity to act independently. As the century progressed, the Ottoman court faced a paradox it could not openly resolve. To survive, it needed to centralize faster than its traditions allowed. To maintain legitimacy, it needed to move slower than its environment permitted. Authority oscillated. Each attempt to assert control exposed its dependence. Each concession preserved form while conceding substance. Europe, by contrast, did not need to be fully understood to exert pressure. Its institutions operated automatically, generating demands regardless of intent. Loans required oversight, trade required standardization, diplomacy required predictability. The Ottoman court confronted outcomes without confronting their underlying structure. It negotiated terms without renegotiating premise. The fracture was not a single event. It was a realization deferred. Authority sensed erosion, but could not locate its source. Was it military, fiscal, diplomatic? Each answer pointed elsewhere. Power confronted its limits obliquely, never directly. The court still believed control was recoverable through better management, better advisors, better sequencing. By the late 19th century, Europe no longer appeared misread so much as unreadable. Its speed, coordination, and institutional density exceeded the interpretive capacity of Ottoman authority. Yet even then, the court did not articulate collapse. It articulated reform. It believed time remained. Authority had not fallen. It had been outpaced. The essay does not end with dissolution because authority itself did not perceive an ending. The Ottoman court continued to govern, legislate, and negotiate under the assumption that sovereignty could be stabilized through careful adjustment. Control still felt possible, Legitimacy still existed. What had changed was invisible from the center. The world no longer waited. Power rarely recognizes the moment it loses interpretive dominance. It continues to act within inherited frames, confident that continuity signals control. The Ottoman misreading of Europe was not a failure of attention, but a failure of translation, of understanding how authority itself had become the constraint it could no longer see. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.